Hello, and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Essentials podcast. We are here today to talk about the world of power purchase agreements, corporate power purchase agreements, and then specifically how we're seeing this play out for the industrial commercial sector in Wales. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Lucy Dolton, the Renewables Generation Lead here at Cornwall Insight, and Ben Burggraaf, CEO of Net Zero Industry Wales. We'll kick off with a round of introductions. So, Lucy, if you wanted to go first.
Hi there, my name's Lucy Dolton. I'm the Renewable Generation Lead at Cornwall Insights. I work within our product and strategy team, but have a lot of subject matter expertise across the world of renewables, subsidy support schemes, and power purchase agreements.
Lovely stuff. Thank you very much. And Ben, if you could do the same, and then also just kind of tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing at Net Zero Industry Wales as well.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Lucy. Borda, good morning. I'm Ben Burggraaf. I head up Net Zero Industry Wales, which is a public-private sector partnership between Welsh Government and industry across Wales. And we're a spin-out from the South Wales Industrial Cluster. And that's a program that was part of the wider Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge Fund. And following that project that was Innovate UK funded, the industry found that there is a bit more a need for closer collaboration between a local government, but also the Dwarf Nation Wales, in actually implementation of that very ambitious plan. So we are focusing as an organization on three kind of main things around really establishing a supportive culture. I call it the Team Wales approach, where companies feel more empowered to take on the journey to net zero rather than feel that net zero is done to them. But also bringing more grant funding into Wales. We're well below the population equivalent when it comes to grant funding going to industry, but also to these kind of very vital projects along other parts of the UK and even wider in Europe. But also the second part, working very closely with Welsh Government, but also UK Government on policy and regulation. We need to make sure that policy and regulation is supportive of actually delivering and implementing that very ambitious plan to ultimately reduce up to 18 to 20 million tons of CO2 in Wales, and which is close to 50% of the total carbon footprint. And Wales is still one of the, I think, nations in the UK with highest population equivalent of carbon emissions and well above the global average. So there's a real need for industry to play its part into that. So policy regulation plays a really big role. And I think particularly with the implementation of that kind of element, we also want to make sure that as an organization, we're playing an active role in delivering that. So we're doing a lot of work, for example, in putting more resource into the planning and consenting process at the moment. Lastly, we're doing quite a bit of work because we have a really good understanding of the kind of decarbonization pathways of individual companies across Wales. And with that information, we also attempt to inform the National Energy System Operator in the development of their plans, as well as the local electricity distribution and transmission system operators, as well as the gas operators, and hopefully in the future also water utilities, because also the latter plays a big role, also alongside the ports, of course. So that all article that gives hopefully a good insight of what we do as an organization.
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much. I think for our conversation today, it'd be really helpful actually probably to start with what we see going on overall in that world of power purchase agreements, role where corporates are fitting in, and what that current policy landscape is. I don't know, Lucy, if that's one that you could kind of talk us through from our perspective here at Cornwall.
Absolutely. Yeah. In short, a lot is going on in the market with PPAs. It's, very much beholden to trends that we see across the wholesale market. So, tracking what we've seen with wholesale pricing somewhat dictates what we see through in the PPA market, or at least certainly for those that are contracting in the near term. And also there's always an interesting dynamic in terms of particular technology types. There's some off-takers that may be able to price things like fixed pricing for wind projects. Others might not have that risk appetite. So it's a really diverse market. There's a lot of off-takers active in the market, and equally from the generation side, PPAs are really crucial in terms of route to market conversations. So whether that's a utility PPA, whether that's a PPA to accompany the CFD and CFD volumes, but equally the role of corporate power purchase agreements and how that sort of fits in there as well. Firstly, I would say we see an interesting dynamic between the CFD and the CPPA market. Historically, it used to be the case that back before we had annual CFD auctions, the CPPA market would almost wait to see the outcome of an allocation round to then be able to get an idea of, okay, this is where the market is pricing, and therefore you'd see perhaps the outcome of an allocation round and then suddenly a flurry of activity in the CPPA market. And I think to a certain extent we do still see that, but now that we have these annual auctions, it's less sort of dictated by dynamics in the CFD. But CPPAs more generally, a lot of demand for CPPAs as a whole. I think, we, from our lens as renewable energy experts and having that interest there, we're always looking at it from a electricity generation and route to market point of view. But for corporates, some have very sophisticated in-house energy trading teams and a really good understanding of decarbonisation and the role of things like CPPAs, all the way through to others that don't have that specialism, which is understandable. That's not their sole business function. And so while for us, a CPPA is very much about generation and looking at that bit of the market or off-takers, for those energy users, it's really often actually seen through the lens of a cost. Energy is a significant cost, particularly when we're talking about industrial users. So while within CPPAs, we see a lot of demand for CPPAs with renewable generators, so, your wind and solar, because of their green status, for some corporates, they may not simply have the budget in order to contract in that sort of way. Equally, they might not have the creditworthiness to enter those agreements as well. So something we're seeing perhaps with CPPAs, maybe more so on the continent at the moment, but I would imagine there'll be growing demand over in sort of GB and particularly when we're talking about Wales, is this idea of CPPA baskets. So actually for those that may not have that creditworthiness, being able to bring together a conglomerate of several organisations that could enter one contract as a whole. We're certainly seeing sort of interest in those more novel approaches. Probably also to note in terms of policy and CPPAs was that we saw a call for evidence from DESNZ back in January. And this was looking at how the CPPA market can support the development of new generation capacity and what government could be doing in that world to make CPPAs more attractive, given that they are complex contracts to negotiate, particularly when you're adding an additional party to a PPA. It's not just a generator and an off-taker, it's also the buyer within that as well that will have their own expectations of pricing, and that can add in its own complexity as well. So we haven't yet seen the response for that call for evidence yet. I think it closed back in March. But interesting, because I think that's probably one of the first times, and Ben, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the first times we've perhaps seen a very specific focus from government on CPPAs within policy. So it was interesting for us to note that one, but equally, very keen to see the outcome of that.
Yeah, Ben, I guess for many of your members, they're sat where the rubber hits the road in a way with that world of PPAs from our perspective. So how are you seeing that play out with some members, maybe in that kind of industrial infrastructure utility space? Are we seeing that kind of interest and engagement with PPAs playing out there?
It varies a bit, actually. I think we just need to talk a bit, around the role of PPAs in this wider context. I think the reason why I think government picked this up, was part of the wider modern industrial strategy. We know that actually other nations in Europe and across the world have used corporate PPAs or equivalent actually to help and reduce power cost, or actually probably stabilize power cost for big industrial overtakers over the last time. And government played a big role in facilitating that, but also perhaps underwriting that. And the risk that Lucy was mentioning around, creditworthiness, particularly for, the renewable generator itself, having a less creditworthy, probably off-taker perhaps. And we know that industry, and particularly heavy industry, is not, the most creditworthiness at the moment for most of the off-takers. And there will be some exceptions, I guess, to this, but most of them are in a really difficult, globally competitive world, which affect that creditworthiness quite significantly. So I think there's a real need to think about how we bring those companies into that corporate PPA kind of world, because I think there's a real need for it. And the real need for it, I think, is driven by really evidencing to members of the public, and particularly communities that are probably in more rural areas of the UK, and also the same is in Wales, where there's a lot of renewable generation potential. So there is somewhere around 5 gigawatts of potential in onshore wind, for example, in Wales alone, that is in development. And also then you have the offshore element of that, particularly with the pipeline on the Celtic Sea and others, about how do you bring that kind of public with you? Because what the kind of narrative has been historically is that, and this is not unlike the water industry, that water actually is exported from Wales and doesn't benefit Wales massively. And the same narrative has actually been played out to communities around that on energy. So There's been, I think, a false kind of narrative going out, and it's probably misinformed rather than misintention. It's around, I think, that Wales is a net exporter of energy. That's not the case. It's a net exporter of electricity. But because that's been perpetuated, rural communities, I think, find it very difficult to understand why do we need to build more. And I think the corporate PPA and the kind of PPA route actually provides a real evidence trail to those communities saying, actually, these projects benefit Welsh industry and Welsh communities and Welsh kind of SME businesses, because Wales is a manufacturing country with a lot of SMEs. And actually, it powers Wales rather than powers the rest of the UK, or let alone provides energy security into Europe. And so we have, as an organization, been putting that at the heart of our kind of strategy that we've been developing with government around that, positioning Wales as a clean energy transition hub, but also remain a cornerstone of the UK industrial base. And the linking of those two, the production of low carbon energy with actually producing high value, sustainable goods and services, I think is really important to drive long-term economic growth. And that brings me then to, I think, the act that we have in Wales is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which has actually one of its well-being goals is around creating a prosperous Wales. And I think that kind of link is really, really strong. So I think there's a real need for, I think, not only in the modern industrial strategy, but also in Wales specifically, to make sure that if we want to be less dependent on imported fossil fuels, and they're still going to play a part actually, but be less dominant, then we need to also convince that actually those renewable generation can actually play a big role in providing an energy secure, but also cost competitive alternative to communities, businesses, but also industry in Wales. And I think one way of doing that is through corporate PPAs. And I think the role that aggregated, you talked about, Lucy, about the basket play in that, I think is really pivotal to reduce the risk, I think, for government, but also for, I think, for those renewable generators.
Yeah, and I think that kind of 5 gigawatt of potential there from onshore gives an indication to, from that generation side of things, the size of the kind of prize that's available here, the scale of that kind of opportunity. I think we don't have to look far at the moment to see basically most, I think, sectors of the economy at this point raising the challenge that energy costs are presenting to them. I wonder, perhaps with that membership view, Ben, whether there's a view on if we can get this right from access and engagement with the kind of clean energy opportunity for those businesses, what the kind of broader opportunity looks like, what are we kind of talking about in scale there for unlocking not just that generation piece, but also that kind of broader economic story?
Yeah, firstly, I think we need to just maybe outline what I think the role of electricity plays within the decarbonization pathways. I mentioned that we've been doing a lot of work on that in the cluster plans. And if you aggregate them, then directly electrification will contribute around 20% of the emissions reductions. It's not insignificant, but it's not as high as people might think. The reason being is that a lot of the industry that we're using is actually using fossil fuels not only as a heat source, and this is I think a general misunderstanding across the specialists in the world around this, is that actually it's also used for chemical reactions, and particularly for the fossil fuels is creating a reaction. It could be as simple on a biscuit, the Maillard reaction that gives you that kind of real taste of a biscuit, but it could also be the reduction of oxidation on a strip of steel, for example, or the kind of refining of a nickel kind of ore, or those kind of things. And we shouldn't forget that that actually fossil fuels are not only there to provide a heat source. I often see, for example, blast furnace is a furnace. So the coal is being used to burn stuff. It's not actually. Predominantly, the coal has been used as a way of stripping the oxygen from the iron ore, which is ferrous oxide rust. And that turns it into iron, and people tend to forget some of that kind of role. And so there is also a big role for hydrogen in that space, which contributes another 40% of that emissions reduction. And indirectly, electricity again could play a role, particularly if a lot of that is done through the deployment of green hydrogen, for example. But I think from the work we've done, blue hydrogen also will play a role into that space. But I think there is a significant role for electrification on that. And I think that is a really key part, I think that's been understood now also by Welsh government, but also by industry. But then the key challenges you mentioned already, the cost element, how do we bring that to a level that actually makes those companies, or remain them, globally cost competitive? And I think this is where I think the big angst is amongst industry of locking in too early or too late or whatever it is going to be, because they don't want to miss the boat and also make their company not cost competitive on the long term. And I think that's a real kind of challenge I think, for a lot of the businesses there. But from my own experience, I've used to work in Tata Steel and in Welsh Water previously. In Welsh Water, we really had used corporate PPAs quite a bit to help as part of a hedging strategy to keep costs down. And the water industry is a bit fortunate in that space because they have these price reviews and they have these clear kind of like targets to work with over a 5-year horizon and work very closely with the regulator. And that place creates a really good space. You can have a long-term view. You can actually have a real kind of pricing strategy on the kind of commodity that is water, because you're effectively a monopoly and that's being restrained by Ofwat. But it creates a really good way of actually layering those corporate PPAs in a volatile kind of environment where most of industry is working in Wales and in the wider UK. And that are the big emitters that want to maybe make better use of green power or low carbon power. They don't have that luxury. I think we need to find a way of bringing it in. And I know that in other nations, the government played a role in that, or whether it's the National Wealth Fund, or whether it's maybe Development Bank of Wales or others could play perhaps a role into de-risking that kind of bid for the off-takers, as well as for the renewable generators. And I think it's a really important thing that we need to do. But the scale of the opportunity is significant. So just to give an idea, at the moment, I think industry uses about 5 terawatt hours. By 2035, it could easily be 15 to 20. So that effect absorbs the full 5 gigawatt of onshore wind I just talked about. And so it is really part of that self-sufficiency story, I think, for Wales. And it's a really powerful story.
And Lucy, thinking to kind of the wider market forecasting, do we see that broad story playing out across the market then, with that kind of rising role for renewable generation and demand, and that kind of opportunity looking similar, or are there different stories?
Yeah, very, very much similar. I think when talking about the scale of the opportunity, it can be, by nature of the question, it's a very open-ended one, and you say, well, how long is a piece of string? But I think if you bring it back to what are the objective facts in our sort of portion of the market, we know that we have targets set through Clean Power 2030, and the role of NESO in promoting that, and government also in enabling that through things like reform national pricing. And, REMA has been a big topic of discussion for a number of years now. So we know that. We know equally that end users of energy are increasingly looking towards decarbonisation, net zero, sort of general, greening of their supply. Equally, we also know that those users are large energy users, and barring any significant technical advances, will probably always be large energy users by nature of the industries that they work within. So we know, if that's sort of the foundation and the groundworks, we know that there are targets in place to bring forward further renewable capacity, and we know that there will be demand to be buying that energy. It's then just a case of under which sort of structures and routes to market might that happen. We know what's happening now. There might be new approaches in future. But I think within our own analysis and forecasting of the market, I think we see about somewhere between 70-75% of all renewables that we have on the system currently have a power purchase agreement. So we know that when we're talking about PPAs, barring those really large scale generators that have direct agreements with government, pretty much all generators will be wanting to look for a PPA, and we're not expecting that role to change drastically, barring some significant intervention and a total overhaul of how the market's working at the moment, which I think we're expecting sort of more incremental changes. So there's ample demand. I think also when you look at it through the lens of Wales particularly, I think, Ben, you mentioned about sort of innovations we're seeing in the Celtic Sea, technologies such as floating offshore wind. I think there's really significant potential there. And I think the planning pipeline in Wales at the moment is perhaps double of what is currently operational within Wales. So even as things stand right now, if you sort of take what we've got currently and double it, but then actually when we're looking out to 2030, that's not going to be a linear increase in generation capacity. Most likely it's more likely to look exponential, particularly when we're looking at the electrification of industry, but also more broadly than that, we're looking at household electrification, etc. So it's absolutely what we're seeing. PPAs are super important for that route to market piece, for new build generation particularly. In order to get financing for their projects, it's pretty much a prerequisite that you must have a PPA to give that confidence to lenders. So yes, I think a short answer to your question, but lots of opportunity there.
And Ben, you touched on kind of where you see some of that role for government in particular in working with industry to try and engage with this. I suppose it'd be good to understand what some of the bigger barriers preventing us kind of seeing that opportunity realised or seeing that role for kind of government and industry realised today?
I think the biggest challenge, for industry is to lock into a long-term power purchase agreement with a world where energy prices are incredibly volatile. Currently, none of the PPA products at the moment really address that volatility properly. There are some PPA products that gives like guide rails or those things where you work in an upper and a lower limit. But I think if there's a significant shift, and we talk about industries that have margins of around a couple of percent, and those could easily be eroded by a big shift in the energy prices, particularly between them and their competitors elsewhere in the world. So I think, and also with the power prices already being significantly higher in the UK and Europe to a certain extent versus other parts in the world, US, for example, and others, and that's well documented. I think there's a big hesitance to actually lock into these kind of prices as we stand. So I think there's an intervention needed, and I think aggregated PPAs could really play a big role in that. The other thing what people should also not underestimate, and I had a personal experience of that myself when I was at Welsh Water. We entered into a PPA while a developer was really getting into financial investment decision. They ended the financial investment decision, but there was a significant delay, and that was caused by a legal challenge from a local community, 1 to 2 years, which then put another 1 to 2 years on the delivery timeline. But that wasn't covered by a hedging strategy anymore as a result of it. And that resulted in a significant overspend because it was the wrong time. So you have to be very careful because the timing and the kind of like how well everything works together. Because if, for example, renewable generator doesn't deliver that project on time, it could pose a significant financial exposure to those off-takers. And again, that kind of aggregated approach, I think, is needed. But then the question is, who's going to do that? So there's either a bank or a financial institute or whatever says I'm going to buy it all up together and have they come up with some kind of a form of a product on that. I think government could play a role into that. And it's also interesting to see what the new Welsh government is going to do, perhaps, and also the role that the Welsh development onshore renewable company, Trydan Grid Cymru, is also going to play into that space. And the same thing, I guess, with GB Energy to a certain extent. So I think it's watch space. But I think there is a need to think about what we could do in an aggregated way around that to actually overcome some of these issues.
Thanks, Ben. And I think that kind of challenging the role for government and where best to fit is a really interesting one. I know, Lucy, you alluded to the kind of call for evidence that we've had on CPPAs and that marking potentially kind of a growing kind of engagement from government here specifically around CPPAs. What do we see as some of the kind of hurdles that government are having to overcome in engaging in that market, and where would we like to see some of that effort come through?
I think if you were to ask anyone that works and operates within the PPA market, they would say that it's a part of the market that functions pretty well without government intervention currently. So I think it's an interesting shift. I'm not saying it's by any means impossible, but an interesting shift for government to now be explicitly seeking views on what can be happening to that market. And I mean, with this specific example with CPPAs, but historically, we've heard from conversations with our customers of they're very much happy with the fact that the PPA market kind of sits almost not in isolation, but as I say, sits without that direct government intervention. So that in itself could potentially be a barrier. I think it's one of those where I think it's great to see the call for evidence, and whatever comes of that is almost only as good as the information that's put into that. So my hope would be that there's been good engagement with that piece of work. So I think that potentially you could sort of see as a bit of a barrier, but also maybe it's a bit of a bigger picture barrier. But I think it's also important to make sure there's always going to be regional differences with these sorts of things. And today we're talking about this specific lens of CPPAs within Wales. But I think we would also want to be sort of sure that nothing is being developed completely in isolation of what may be happening in England or Scotland or on the continent. I think there's perhaps a bit cliche to say, but there's lots that we can learn from markets that are doing these things really well and almost expedite that process of getting to a well-functioning CPPA market within Wales and making sure that something that's being developed in one area is equally applied to another, and we're not missing opportunities just by nature of either being within one jurisdiction or another. So it's always a little bit of a trade-off of where there's similarities and differences within particular markets. But I think we've got plenty that we can learn from existing CPPA interactions, but equally then how that incorporates any potential policy, maybe not changes, but policy developments within the market itself.
And I think to perhaps date our discussions today, but we're recording this amidst either an emerging leadership challenge or coronation of a kind of new Labour leader and new Prime Minister. And it'd be nice perhaps to kind of close with Ben, initially from yourself, what your kind of one hope for the incoming administration, whatever kind of shape that might take, what your kind of one hope for them would be for kind of supporting unlocking some of that opportunity that we've talked about today.
I think my one hope is something that I've been voicing for a long time, actually, is that I think if you look at the challenge, and I alluded that a bit earlier on, that we have actually a disproportionate, higher than population equivalent challenge with regards to decarbonization. But we're receiving well below population equivalent of the CFD kind of going towards Wales, the kind of like allocations. We get well below the kind of population equivalent on CO2 business model support, hydrogen business model support, those kind of things. There have been a couple of exemptions. So the IETF, Industrial Energy Transition Fund, I think we did a little bit above population equivalent. So that was good, I think, from that perspective. But I think with the kind of new incoming Prime Minister really voicing his kind of desire to have more devolved kind of like, I think, a strategy in using more devolved powers. And I think is really aiding, I think, some of that, or is aligned with some of that voice. Because I think what Wales needs is to get close to 10 to 15% of some of the allocations going to Wales, because that is what its emission burden is in Wales. And I think that's also the contribution that industry is making towards the UK ETF, so the emission trading scheme revenue that's generated annually. And that money doesn't flow back in the same way that might happen in other European nations because of the different approaches between EU ETS and UK ETS on how that money is redistributed. So I really hope that with the kind of strategy laid out earlier this week and this desire that is a bit aligned with that, because we do desperately need some of that funding to flow more towards Wales to empower Cymru literally to really take on that journey to net zero and become a little bit more energy secure.
And then perhaps with the kind of market lens, that be interesting, Lucy, just to hear before we close, kind of what is the kind of key thing that we're expecting to see, or that we're watching with interest over the kind of next 6 months as well?
That's a good question. I think, as you say, certainly where we are politically is always going to be one to watch. I think that, as Ben, you mentioned, sort of that potential shift to a more devolved or, devolution sort of perspective is also interesting when you look at that alongside going back to Clean Power 2030 and some of the work coming in through that of clearly location is quite an important factor or a growing factor in not only sort of from that very high level politics, but also the siting of new renewable assets. We've got that very sort of specific focus through those pieces of work. So I think that's an interesting shift. And I think watching that, we haven't even touched upon topics such as connections reform, probably a total tangent and worthy of another podcast itself. But equally, that is putting a very locational specific lens on things. So I think it'll be a case of watching how that supports new build generation coming onto the system, but equally then considering that as a whole of not only from the generation perspective, but also when we're talking about PPAs, those that are buying the power, how we can do that in a way that works best in those respective locations, knowing that there are particular regions where it might be more industry intensive, for example, it might be more suitable for solar generation. There's lots of different criteria there, but equally, I think maybe the point as well about sort of a hope of what to see from government would also be making sure that they are engaging, particularly now that we might be seeing this more regional specific focus, engaging with those in the market working in those particular areas. Because I think, going back to my previous points of the PPA market operating currently without much, if any, government intervention, some of the best sort of ideas and innovations come from those where working within renewable generation and routes to market and contracting these large scale PPAs. Those best ideas come from those working in those areas day to day. They know the subject area really well. They understand the challenges because they are the ones facing it. So I think anything that is developed through any potential future changes, we'll be watching that. We'll be watching things like the CFD, for example. I think historically we've perhaps seen slightly lesser engagement with the CFD within Wales. So it'd be interesting to see if there's any particular levers that can be drawn to support that. But by nature of something like that being a competitive auction, we know that there's always going to be winners and losers, so to speak, because of that. So yeah, a lot to be keeping an eye on. Clean Power 2030, definitely connections reform and the ongoing process of that. Any potential changes out of reform national pricing, you name it, there's a lot to be watching. But certainly makes for an exciting day job.
No, agreed. So all that we are really left with is for me to say thank you very much to Ben Burggraaf and to Lucy Dolton for joining me this morning. Encourage anybody who is keen to understand a bit more about the kind of market trends that we've discussed, about where we see values getting benchmarked across the space, where we see this market moving, to get in touch. If you can't log into your Catalyst account and find this in your Market Intel subscription, we'd love to chat about helping you there. And finally, I'll just ask you, Ben, for anybody who's keen to understand a bit more about the work that Net Zero Industry Wales are doing, or to engage with this, where's the kind of best place to find you and to find out more?
Yeah, the best place is follow us on LinkedIn, Net Zero Industry Wales. You find us there. There's some really regular updates on that. We also have our own website, that is www.nziw.wales. And there's some interesting blogs on there. And we've got some thought leadership, but also I think there's some really interesting resources on there, particularly around decarbonization pathways, an interactive kind of like tool for that, as well as a list of projects. The Welsh kind of like ecosystem map around the investment. So there's a lot of resources there for people to tap into. Also, we've got a big event coming up on the 29th of September in Cardiff, Empower Cymru, where we're going to run an expo, effectively bringing a lot of these projects in the hydrogen renewable space and into CCS space. All of the kind of like clean energy kind of like ecosystem will be going to Techniquest, the Science Museum, to display the real projects that are happening in Wales and the kind of exciting and buoyant kind of investment climate we're starting to develop in Wales around that. So yeah, come and see, I would say.
No, it sounds excellent. And what better call to action to end us on? And I'd look forward to seeing you and some of the listeners there. Thanks very much, everyone. And thank you all for listening. See you next time.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.